My friends, the possibility of Zadarius Smith returning to Detroit has suddenly become one of the most intriguing storylines surrounding the Lions, and it all started because of a development that few people were expecting. News emerged that Zadarius Smith has officially been released from the Philadelphia Eagles reserve retired list, a move that immediately sparked questions about whether the veteran edge rusher is preparing for another NFL opportunity. For Lions fans, this news carries extra weight because Smith's time in Detroit never truly felt complete. When the Lions acquired him at the 2024 trade deadline, the expectation was that he would help strengthen the pass rush during a critical stretch of the season. He arrived with experience, production, and a reputation as a player capable of making an impact when his team needed him most. Even though his stay in Detroit was relatively short, he quickly became an important part of the defensive front. What makes this situation so interesting is everything that happened afterward. Despite still being under contract, Smith was released during the offseason. Detroit decided to move on, and the decision surprised many observers because he had actually contributed after arriving. Shortly after the Lions indicated they were comfortable with their situation at edge rusher, Smith eventually signed with Philadelphia. However, his Eagles tenure never lasted very long. After appearing in only 5 games, he unexpectedly stepped away from football. Now, with the latest news indicating that he is no longer tied to Philadelphia's reserve retired list, speculation naturally begins again. At just 33 years old, Smith is not a player who is far removed from contributing at the NFL level. While age becomes a factor for every pass rusher eventually, there are still veterans around the league who continue producing well into their 30s. That reality alone makes the possibility difficult to ignore. Looking back at Smith's production helps explain why some Lions fans remain interested. Over the course of his career, he has accumulated 70.5 sacks and forced 10 fumbles. Those numbers reflect years of consistent production and experience against some of the best offensive tackles in football. Even during the period surrounding his trade to Detroit, he continued to show an ability to pressure quarterbacks and disrupt offenses. When Smith arrived in Detroit, he provided something the team desperately needed: another pass rushing threat opposite Aiden Hutchinson. Injuries and roster challenges forced the Lions to search for answers, and Smith stepped into that role. In 9 games with Detroit, he recorded 4 sacks. Before the trade, he had already produced 5 sacks in Cleveland. Even during his brief stint with Philadelphia, he managed to register another 1.5 sacks while working as part of a rotational unit. That production is why the conversation refuses to disappear. Detroit's goal is not simply to build a competitive roster anymore. The goal is winning a Super Bowl. Every roster decision is now viewed through that lens. The question is no longer whether a player can help occasionally. The question is whether he can improve the team's chances of competing for a championship. The Lions already possess one of the league's premier defensive stars in Aiden Hutchinson, but depth along the edge remains a topic that fans continue to discuss. Young players are developing, rookies are entering the picture, and several rotational options exist, but proven veteran production is still valuable. A player like Smith would not necessarily be expected to carry the defense. Instead, he could provide experience, leadership, and additional pass rush support in key situations. There is also an interesting football question that remains unanswered. Lions fans never truly got the opportunity to see a healthy, extended pairing of Hutchinson and Smith operating together for a meaningful period. Injuries and circumstances prevented that combination from fully developing. The possibility of finally seeing those two players share the field consistently is something that naturally generates curiosity among the fan base. At the same time, there are obvious concerns. Smith has been away from football for a significant period. Returning to NFL shape is never automatic. Even experienced veterans need time to adjust physically and mentally after stepping away from the game. Any team considering him would need to evaluate whether he can still perform at the level required to contribute during a championship pursuit. Yet the timing of this news is impossible to ignore. The Eagles' decision to release him from the reserve as retired list means he is no longer automatically connected to Philadelphia if he decides to play again. For the first time since his retirement, the door appears open. If Smith wants another opportunity, he now has the flexibility to explore where that opportunity might come from. And that is where the conversation circles back to Detroit. The Lions know him. He knows the organization. He has already played alongside many of the players currently on the roster. There is familiarity on both sides, and familiarity often matters when teams are looking for veteran contributors who can integrate quickly. The biggest question now is whether either side has interest in revisiting what once appeared to be a finished chapter. Could Detroit see value in adding a veteran edge presence for a potential Super Bowl run? Could Smith view Detroit as the right place to continue his career after everything that has happened over the last 2 years? Those answers remain unknown for now, but the possibility has suddenly become very real. With the news now out in the open and speculation growing among Lions fans, one question stands above all the others. If Za'Darius Smith decides he wants to play football again, should the Detroit Lions be the team that gives him that opportunity? The financial side of the discussion is another reason why this story continues to gain attention among Lions fans. If Detroit were to consider bringing Za'Darius Smith back, the move would not necessarily require the kind of massive investment that teams typically make when pursuing a premier free agent. In fact, because of his age, his time away from football, and the circumstances surrounding his retirement, any potential contract would likely be structured around incentives and expectations that protect the team while rewarding production. That reality makes the conversation much easier to have. The Lions are no longer a rebuilding organization searching for long-term developmental projects. They are operating with a roster built to compete right now. Every available move is measured against one standard. Does it increase the team's chances of winning a Super Bowl? When viewed through that lens, adding an experienced pass rusher becomes easier to justify. Detroit has invested heavily in building a talented roster, but championship teams understand the importance of depth. The NFL season is long, injuries are inevitable, and pass rushers often rotate heavily to stay fresh throughout games. Even if Smith were not expected to be a full-time starter, there is value in having another veteran who understands how to pressure quarterbacks in critical moments. Experience is one of the few things that cannot be taught. Young players develop over time, but veterans bring years of knowledge into meeting rooms, practices, and game situations. Smith has spent years competing against elite offenses. He has played meaningful football games. He has been part of playoff races. He understands the pressure that comes with expectations. That kind of presence can have an impact beyond the stat sheet. Imagine a situation where Detroit enters the postseason with championship aspirations. Having additional pass rush options available could prove critical. Defensive coordinators love flexibility, and veteran players who understand multiple roles often become valuable pieces during playoff football. Smith would not necessarily have to be the dominant force he once was earlier in his career. He would simply need to contribute when opportunities arise. Another element that cannot be ignored is the emotional aspect of the story. When Smith was released, there never seemed to be public hostility between him and the organization. There were no major controversies. There were no public attacks directed toward the Lions. Instead, the situation appeared to be viewed as a business decision. That distinction matters because it leaves the door open for future conversations. Many players leave teams on bad terms and never look back. This situation never fully felt that way. In fact, looking at how events unfolded, it is understandable why some people believe Smith may have still hoped for another opportunity in Detroit after his release. The timeline raises interesting questions. He expressed interest in returning. Detroit moved in another direction. Shortly afterward, he joined Philadelphia. Then came the unexpected retirement. Whether those events are connected is something only the people involved truly know. But from the outside, it is easy to understand why Lions fans continue to wonder if unfinished business exists between both sides. From a football perspective, there is little risk in at least exploring the possibility. The worst outcome is simple. Conversations happen and nothing develops. Teams make calls every day to gauge interest, evaluate players, and investigate opportunities. That process is part of building a championship roster. Not every conversation leads to a contract, but every successful front office explores available options. Meanwhile, the potential upside remains intriguing. Detroit's defense continues to evolve. The organization believes in its young talent, and rightly so. However, contenders often combine youth with veteran experience. The balance between those two elements can make the difference during a playoff run. That is why this story is unlikely to disappear anytime soon. As training camp approaches and the season gets closer, roster discussions will only become more intense. Fans are eager to move beyond offseason speculation and finally see the team back on the field competing for victories. Expectations remain incredibly high. The disappointment of the previous season still lingers, and supporters are desperate to see Detroit take the final step toward a championship. Every potential addition will be analyzed through that perspective. Can this player help the Lions win? Can this player improve the defense? Can this player contribute during the biggest moments of the season? Those are the questions surrounding Za'Darius Smith right now. What makes the situation fascinating is that the answer may not depend solely on Detroit. Smith now has freedom. If he wants to continue continue his career, he can evaluate opportunities across the league. Multiple teams could potentially have interest in a veteran pass rusher with his resume. The Lions may be familiar territory, but they would not necessarily be the only option, and yet there is something compelling about the idea of returning to the place where the story unexpectedly ended. Perhaps it never happens. Perhaps Smith signs elsewhere. Perhaps he decides retirement remains the right choice. All of those outcomes are possible. But for now, the possibility exists, and that alone has created one of the most talked about discussions among Lions fans during this stretch of the offseason. As the countdown to football season continues and Detroit prepares for another year with Super Bowl expectations, everyone will be watching to see whether this unexpected storyline develops into something more than speculation. If a phone call is made, if conversations begin, and if the opportunity becomes real, the Lions will have a decision to make. And if that moment arrives, fans throughout Detroit will be asking the same question. Would a reunion with Zadarius Smith be the missing piece that strengthens this defense for a championship run? There is also a broader reason why this conversation has captured so much attention among Lions fans, and it goes beyond Zadarius Smith himself. It reflects where this franchise currently stands. Not long ago, Detroit supporters spent every offseason hoping the team could simply become competitive. The discussion revolved around rebuilding, developing young talent, and finding foundational players who could eventually change the culture of the organization. Today, the conversation is completely different. Now the focus is on championship windows. That shift changes how every roster decision is viewed. Fans are no longer asking whether a player can help the team win a few more games. They're asking whether a player can help bring a Lombardi trophy to Detroit. That is why the possibility of adding a veteran like Smith continues to generate debate. When Aiden Hutchinson suffered his injury, Detroit's defense immediately faced a challenge. The Lions needed someone capable of generating pressure against opposing quarterbacks, and Smith stepped into that role. Whether people agree or disagree about bringing him back, one fact remains difficult to ignore. He became one of Detroit's most productive pass rush threats during a period when the defense desperately needed one. That production is part of the reason many fans feel there is still unfinished business. Imagine a scenario where Smith